To understand the world, you must understand the crossroads of the world. Look at a map of the Middle East, and your eyes are immediately drawn to a massive, imposing geological fortress. It is a plateau raised up by the violent collision of tectonic plates, ringed by jagged, almost impenetrable mountain ranges. The Zagros forming a towering wall to the west, the Alborz cutting off the north. Between these stony ramparts lie vast, scorching deserts, the Dasht-e-Kavr and the Dasht-e-Lut, where summer heat can melt the courage of any invading army, and the wind howls over oceans of salt and sand. This is the Iranian Plateau. For over 5,000 years, this unforgiving, breathtakingly beautiful landscape has been the crucible of one of the most resilient, influential, and deeply misunderstood civilizations in human history. It is a land that has birthed empires, stretching across 3 continents, a land shattered by apocalyptic invasions, and a land that, time and time again, has absorbed its conquerors, teaching them how to speak, how to govern, and how to build. This is the story of Persia. This is the entire, unbroken history of Iran. Long before the word Persia was ever spoken, the southwestern corner of this plateau, where the mountains bleed down into the Mesopotamian basin, was already alive with the hum of advanced civilization. Over 5,000 years ago, alongside the dawn of Sumer and Egypt, the Elamites built a sophisticated, flourishing kingdom here. Their capital, Susa, remains one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on planet Earth. The Elamites were master builders. At Chogha-Zanbil, they constructed a massive, terraced ziggurat of baked brick, a towering artificial mountain dedicated to their bull god in Shushinak, ascending toward the heavens. They developed their own complex writing system, independent of their neighbors, and traded vast quantities of timber, tin, and precious lapis lazuli. For over 2 millennia, the Elamites were the undisputed masters of the lowlands, locked in a brutal, endless cycle of warfare with the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and eventually, the terrifying military machine of the Assyrian Empire. In 647 BC, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal razed Susa to the ground, slaughtering its people and sowing its fields with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. But the true ancestors of modern Iran would not emerge from the ashes of Susa. They would come from the deep, freezing steppes of the north. Around the 2nd millennium BC, waves of nomadic horse-riding tribes swept down from Central Asia, migrating into the rugged valleys of the plateau. They called themselves the Aryans, a word that in their ancient tongue simply translated to the noble ones. The vast high-altitude land they settled became known as Aryanam Veja, the land of the Aryans, which over thousands of years would evolve phonetically into the modern word Iran. These Indo-Iranian tribes fractured into several dominant groups. In the lush, mountainous northwest, the Medes established themselves. In the arid, sun-baked south, near the waters of the Persian Gulf, settled a tribe known as the Pars. The ancient Greeks would later call this southern region Persis, and from that geographic misnomer, the entire sprawling civilization would become known to the Western world as Persia. For centuries, it was the Medes who were the dominant, terrifying force. From their capital of Ecbatana, the Medes built a powerful, militaristic kingdom. Allied with the Babylonians, they finally took their revenge on the Assyrians, sacking the great city of Nineveh in 612 BC and wiping the Assyrian Empire off the map. But the Medes ruled with a heavy hand, and the course of world history was about to shift forever, not from the halls of Ecbatana, but from the southern mountains of the Pars, thanks to a single visionary man. His name was Cyrus. History remembers him as Cyrus the Great. In 550 BC, Cyrus, a brilliant tactician and a charismatic leader of the Pars tribe, rebelled against his Median overlords. In a lightning-fast campaign, he defeated the Median king Astyages, but he did something unprecedented. He did not execute the king, nor did he burn the capital. He united the Medes and the Persians into a single, unstoppable military and political force. But Cyrus was entirely unlike the brutal iron-fisted conquerors who came before him, where the Assyrians and Babylonians ruled through sheer bloody terror, mass deportations, and the violent desecration of local gods. Cyrus introduced a radically new concept to the geopolitical stage: imperial tolerance. When Cyrus marched his armies toward the legendary, impregnable city of Babylon in 539 BC, the city essentially opened its gates to him. He did not put it to the torch. He walked through its towering blue Ishtar gate, bowed in respect to the local Babylonian god Marduk, and then made a decree that changed the world. He freed the enslaved Jewish people who had been held captive in Babylon for decades, providing them with funds and safe passage to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. He declared that all people within his vast empire were free to practice their own religions, speak their own languages, and keep their own customs, so long as they paid their taxes and kept the king's peace. This decree, stamped onto a baked clay cylinder known as the Cyrus cylinder, is widely revered by modern historians as the first declaration of human rights in the ancient world. Cyrus died in battle on the eastern frontiers, fighting the nomadic Massageti tribes, but he had laid the bedrock for the Achaemenid Empire, the first true global superpower. His son, Cambyses, added the ancient kingdom of Egypt to the empire, but it was under Darius the Great that Persia reached its absolute zenith. Darius was an administrative genius. He inherited an empire stretching from the snowy peaks of the Balkans in Eastern Europe, across the entirety of the Middle East, all the way to the lush, humid valleys of the Indus River in modern-day Pakistan. It encompassed nearly 50 million people, an estimated 44% of the entire human population living on Earth at the time. No empire before or since has held such a massive percentage of humanity. To govern this colossal beast, Darius divided the empire into 20 provinces, known as satrapies, each ruled by a governor. To connect them, he constructed the Royal Road, an awe-inspiring highway system stretching over 1,500 miles from Sardis in modern Turkey to Susa. Relays of men and horses were stationed a day's ride apart, allowing imperial messages to cross the vast empire in a matter of days, a feat of logistics that the Greek historian Herodotus praised, writing, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Darius standardized currency, introducing the gold daric, and standardized weights and measures. He built the breathtaking ceremonial capital of Persepolis. Carved directly into the mountainside, Persepolis was a city of towering, fluted pillars, monumental staircases, and exquisite stone reliefs. These reliefs did not depict conquered peoples in chains being tortured, as was the custom of earlier empires. Instead, they showed subjects from all corners of the world, Ethiopians, Indians, Greeks, and Arabs, bringing gifts in respectful, dignified procession to the King of Kings. The Persian Empire was the undisputed master of the globe, but on their far western frontier, across the churning waters of the Aegean Sea, lay a scattered collection of fractured, bickering, fiercely independent city-states that stubbornly refused to offer earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission. These were the Greeks. The resulting Greco-Persian Wars would become the foundational myth of Western civilization. When the Greek city of Athens aided a rebellion in Persian territory, Darius swore vengeance, ordering a servant to whisper in his ear before every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." Darius's punitive expedition ended in failure on the beaches of Marathon in 490 BC. 10 years later, his son Xerxes launched the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen, physically lashing boats together to build a mile-long pontoon bridge across the Hellespont so his massive army could walk on water. To the west, the battles that followed, the heroic Spartan last stand at the narrow, bloody pass of Thermopylae, and the devastating Persian naval defeat at Salamis, are remembered as an existential clash between freedom and tyranny. To the Persians, however, this was merely a frustrating border skirmish, a failed attempt to pacify a rowdy, unstable neighbor at the extreme edge of the map. The Persians eventually retreated from Greece, calculating that it was cheaper and far more effective to simply manipulate the warring Greek city-states with Persian gold rather than Persian iron. But the Greeks had long memories. A century and a half later, in 334 BC, a young, brilliant, and violently ambitious Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont into Asia. Alexander the Great tore through the massive, lumbering Achaemenid Empire with a speed and tactical ferocity that shattered the ancient geopolitical order. At the battles of Granicus, Issus, and finally Gaugamela, Alexander's highly disciplined phalanxes and elite companion cavalry repeatedly crushed the massive, multi-ethnic armies of King Darius III. Alexander marched triumphantly into Babylon, Susa, and finally the magnificent halls of Persepolis. There, after a night of heavy drinking, supposedly urged on by an Athenian courtesan seeking revenge for the Persian burning of the Acropolis a century earlier, Alexander put Persepolis to the torch. The grandest city on earth, the architectural crown jewel of humanity, was reduced to a blackened, smoking skeleton. The Achaemenid Empire, which had ordered the world for 2 centuries, was dead. In the West, Alexander is immortalized as the Great. In ancient Zoroastrian Persian literature, he is remembered quite differently. He is Iskandar the Accursed. Alexander's massive empire shattered almost the moment he drew his last breath in Babylon at the age of 32. His generals carved up the world. The Iranian Plateau fell to Seleucus, who founded the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids aggressively tried to impose Hellenistic culture, Greek language, and Greek gods onto the Persians. It was a spectacular failure. The plateau is too vast, too rugged, and its people too deeply rooted in their own identity to be overwritten. From the northeastern steppes, near the shores of the Caspian Sea, a new force emerged. They were the Parthians, a fierce, nomadic people who practically lived in the saddle. They slowly but violently pushed the Greeks out, establishing an empire that would last for nearly 500 years. The Parthians were not great builders like the Achaemenids, but they were the absolute masters of cavalry warfare. They became the great, terrifying eastern nightmare of the Roman Empire. When the Roman general Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, seeking military glory to rival Julius Caesar, marched a massive army of heavily armored legionaries into Parthian territory in 53 BC, he was met at the Battle of Carrhae. The Parthians deployed an agonizingly brilliant tactic. Heavily armored cataphracts pinned the Romans down, while highly mobile horse archers circled them, raining down a ceaseless, terrifying storm of arrows. When a Parthian rider appeared to retreat, he would suddenly twist backward in his saddle at full gallop and fire a lethal volley into his pursuers. This devastating maneuver became legendary as the Parthian shot. Crassus was annihilated. According to legend, the Parthians poured molten gold down the dead Roman's throat to mock his insatiable greed. For centuries, the border between the Roman eagles and the Parthian horsemen fluctuated violently along the Euphrates, a clash of ancient superpowers that defined the era. But empires rot from within, exhausted by dynastic squabbles and endless frontier wars. By the 3rd century AD, the Parthian dynasty was bleeding out. In 224 AD, a local ruler from the ancient Persian heartland of Fars, the very same region Cyrus had come from, rose up in rebellion. His name was Ardashir. He crushed the last Parthian king on the battlefield and forged a new, aggressively nationalist and deeply religious empire, the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanids saw themselves as the true, rightful heirs of the ancient Achaemenids. They actively sought to purge centuries of Greek and Parthian cultural dilution, establishing a highly centralized, bureaucratic state. Crucially, they institutionalized religion. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian monotheistic faith emphasizing the eternal, cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda, the god of truth and light, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of lies and darkness, was codified as the absolute state religion. The Sassanid era was a magnificent golden age. They built massive universities like the Academy of Gondishapur, which became the greatest center of medical, philosophical, and mathematical learning in the world, sheltering exiled scholars from Greece and India. They dominated the lucrative Silk Road trade, sending Persian silks and silver as far as the imperial courts of China. And they fought the Romans. The Sassanids were a terrifying, organized military machine. In 260 AD, at the Battle of Edessa, the Sassanid king Shapur I did the unthinkable. He didn't just defeat the Roman army, he captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive. Shapur immortalized this unimaginable humiliation by carving massive rock reliefs at Nakhchi Rostam, showing the Roman emperor kneeling in submission before the Persian king. According to Roman historians, Shapur used the captive emperor as a human footstool to mount his horse, and when Valerian finally died in captivity, Shapur had his skin flayed, dyed deep purple, stuffed with straw, and hung from the ceiling of a Persian temple. For 4 long centuries, the Sassanids and the Roman, later Byzantine, empires battered each other to a bloody, exhausting standstill. In the early 7th century, the Sassanid king Khosrow II launched a final climactic war against the Byzantine emperor Heraclius. It was a world war of antiquity, lasting nearly 3 decades. The Sassanids marched all the way to the shores of the Bosporus, besieging Constantinople itself and capturing the True Cross from Jerusalem. But Heraclius launched a daring counterattack, marching deep into the Iranian Plateau, destroying sacred Zoroastrian fire temples. By the time an exhausted peace was finally declared in 628 AD, both magnificent empires were utterly hollowed out, their treasuries completely empty, their armies decimated, and their political centers collapsing into civil war. Blinded by their endless obsession with each other, neither the Persians nor the Byzantines noticed the storm gathering in the deep, harsh deserts to the south. In the sun-scorched expanse of the Arabian Peninsula, a new, fiery, monotheistic religion had united the eternally warring Bedouin tribes. Fired by the profound zeal of Islam and seeking immediate expansion, Arab armies burst out of the desert. The Byzantine and Sassanid empires, critically weakened and fractured, were caught completely off guard. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 AD, the massive, heavily armored Sassanid army, complete with war elephants, was decisively outmaneuvered and crushed by the lighter, faster, highly motivated Arab cavalry. The Arab army swept across the Iranian Plateau like a tidal wave. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward as a desperate fugitive, abandoning his empire until he was quietly murdered for his jewelry by a local miller in the city of Merv. The ancient Persian Empire had fallen. The Islamic conquest was a cataclysmic, world-altering turning point. The ancient Zoroastrian faith, which had guided the Iranian soul for millennia, was largely swept away, replaced by Islam. For many great civilizations conquered by the advancing Arab armies, from the ancient Egyptians to the Arameans in Syria, their local languages and native cultures were eventually entirely erased, replaced completely by Arab identity. But Iran was different. The Persians had lost their empire, their kings, and their religion, but they possessed a cultural arrogance and a historical memory so deep that they completely refused to lose their identity. Instead of being Arabized, the Persians effectively Persianized their conquerors. When the Abbasid Caliphate came to power in the mid-8th century, overthrowing the Arab-centric Umayyads, they relied heavily on Persian political support. The Abbasids moved the political center of the Islamic world away from the Mediterranean, building a magnificent new capital designed by Persian engineers, Baghdad. The administration, the sophisticated court etiquette, the art, and the philosophical underpinnings of the Islamic Golden Age were massively driven by Persian scholars, scientists, and bureaucrats. Persians translated ancient Greek texts, developed algebra, and mapped the stars. Brilliant Persian minds like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote medical encyclopedias that would be used in European universities for the next 600 years. The mathematician and poet Omar Khayyam calculated the length of the solar year with a precision that rivals modern atomic clocks. But the most crucial act of cultural preservation happened at the end of the 10th century. A poet named Ferdowsi, living in the eastern city of Tus, spent 30 agonizing years of his life writing a massive epic poem containing over 50,000 rhyming couplets. It was called the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. It wove together the mythical and historical past of Persia, telling the epic tales of heroes like Rostam and his tragic battle with his son Sohrab, stretching all the way to the fall of the Sassanids. Crucially, Ferdowsi wrote the Shahnameh almost entirely in pure Persian, deliberately avoiding the Arabic loanwords that were flooding the region. The Shahnameh single-handedly saved the Persian language from extinction. It provided a cultural anchor. It remains the beating heart of Iranian identity to this day, a book found in nearly every Iranian home alongside the Quran. As the centuries rolled on, the central authority of the Arab caliphates fractured and weakened. The Iranian Plateau became the domain of Turkic nomads migrating westward from Central Asia. But the ancient pattern held true. When the Seljuk Turks established a massive empire stretching to the gates of Constantinople in the 11th century, they completely embraced Persian culture. Their brilliant Persian vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, ran the empire, establishing a network of universities called Nezamayez. Yet this era also birthed the terrifying Order of Assassins, led by the enigmatic Hassan-i Sabbah. From the impregnable mountain fortress of Alamut, the assassins utilized targeted political murder, dispatching highly trained agents to strike down viziers, generals, and even kings across the Middle East, injecting a deep paranoia into the medieval Islamic world. But the 13th century would bring a horror unlike anything humanity had ever seen. From the deep freezing steppes of Mongolia came Genghis Khan. The Mongol invasion of the Iranian Plateau was not a military conquest. It was an apocalyptic extinction event. When the Khwarezmian Shah, who ruled the region, foolishly executed Genghis Khan's trade envoys at the city of Otrar, he unleashed the wrath of the Mongol war machine. When great ancient cities like Nishapur and Merv attempted to resist, the Mongols didn't just defeat their armies, they exterminated their entire populations. They systematically slaughtered millions. Men, women, and children were beheaded, and pyramids were built out of their skulls outside the ruined city walls. The Mongols deliberately destroyed the ancient, delicate underground irrigation channels known as qanats, turning fertile, life-sustaining farmland back into dead, glowing desert. They burned the great libraries of Khorasan. It is estimated that the population of the Iranian Plateau dropped by a staggering 75%. It was a demographic and cultural catastrophe from which the region would take centuries to recover. The Mongol Ilkhanate ruled over the smoking ashes of Persia. But astonishingly, the ancient gravity of the plateau exerted its force once again. The brutal Mongol warlords, and later the devastating conqueror Timur, or Tamerlane, who built his own mountain of skulls in Isfahan, eventually converted to Islam. They adopted the Persian language. They became magnificent patrons of Persian miniature painting, poetry, and architecture, building the turquoise-domed mosques of Samarkand. Persia, bleeding and broken, slowly swallowed its conquerors. It wasn't until the dawn of the 16th century that a truly native Iranian dynasty would rise from the ashes and violently forge the borders and the religious identity of the modern state. In 1501, a charismatic, ruthless, and mystically inclined 14-year-old boy named Shah Ismail marched his fanatical Turkoman warriors, the Shizilbash, into the city of Tabriz. He declared himself the Shah of Iran, founding the Safavid Empire. But Ismail did something that would permanently and violently sever Iran from its neighbors. He decreed that Twelver Shia Islam was the official mandatory state religion of his new empire. Until this point, the vast majority of the Iranian population had been Sunni Muslims. Ismail violently forced the conversion of his people, executing Sunni clerics who refused to comply. This massive geopolitical shift created a solid, unified Iranian identity, a Shia island surrounded by a sea of Sunni powers, most notably the mighty Ottoman Empire to the west. The bitter, bloody rivalry between the Shia Safavids and the Sunni Ottomans culminated at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, where Ottoman gunpowder and artillery crushed Safavid cavalry. But the Safavids survived, and the sectarian fault lines drawn during this era are still fiercely burning across the Middle East today. The Safavid era reached its absolute zenith under Shah Abbas the Great in the early 17th century. Seeking to centralize power and protect his realm from the Ottomans, he moved his capital deep into the center of the plateau, to the city of Isfahan. He transformed it into a masterpiece of urban planning. He built a city so spectacular, so full of grand, sweeping public squares, intricate gardens, and colossal mosques adorned with millions of blue tiles, that a popular proverb was born: Esfahan Nesf-e-Jahan. Isfahan is half the world. Shah Abbas established a booming, globally connected economy, forcibly relocating thousands of Armenian Christian merchants to a suburb called New Julfa to manage the highly lucrative global trade of exquisite Persian silk and carpets. But like all empires, the Safavids eventually grew decadent, corrupt, and weak. In 1722, a relatively small force of Afghan rebels besieged Isfahan. The siege was so agonizingly long that the population resorted to eating dogs, cats, and eventually human flesh. The Safavid dynasty collapsed, plunging Iran into absolute chaos. Out of this wreckage emerged a brilliant, brutally effective military commander named Nader Shah. Often referred to as the Napoleon of Persia, Nader Shah violently reunited the country, pushed the opportunistic Ottomans and Russians back out of Iranian territory, and then, in need of cash to fund his massive military machine, launched a devastating invasion of India in 1739. He annihilated the Mughal army and sacked Delhi, engaging in a horrific massacre of its citizens. He returned to Iran with a caravan of loot so massive, including the legendary jewel-encrusted peacock throne and the colossal Koh-i-Noor diamond, that he suspended all taxation in Iran for 3 entire years. But his tactical brilliance descended into severe paranoid madness. He blinded his own son on suspicion of treason, and his reign of terror only ended when his own exhausted officers assassinated him in his tent in the dead of night. Following a brief period of peace and stability in the southern city of Shiraz under the benevolent ruler Karim Khan Zand, the end of the 18th century brought the Qajar dynasty, founded by Aga Muhammad Khan, a cruel, castrated warlord who unified the country through unspeakable brutality, including ordering the gouging out of 20,000 pairs of eyes from the defiant citizens of Kerman. The Qajar era would become a period of painful, agonizing decline and national humiliation. As the 19th century dawned, Iran found itself caught directly in the jaws of the Great Game, the bitter, shadowy, high-stakes geopolitical rivalry between the rapidly expanding Russian Empire plunging south from the Caucasus and the British Empire expanding westward from its crown jewel in India. The Qajar Shahs were weak, deeply corrupt, and completely outmatched by the industrialized modern militaries of the European powers. Iran fought 2 disastrous wars with Russia, culminating in the humiliating treaties of Gulistan and Turkmenchay. Iran permanently lost the vital, wealthy territories of the Caucasus, modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, to the Russian Tsar. To fund their lavish, decadent lifestyles and their incredibly expensive, extravagant royal tours of Europe, the Qajar Shahs began selling off massive pieces of the Iranian economy to foreign powers through concessions. The British gained total control of the telegraph networks, the banking system, the customs houses, and even the national tobacco monopoly. Iran was never formally colonized with foreign troops on every corner, but it was essentially carved up into European spheres of influence, financially bled dry. The proud, ancient civilization of Cyrus and Shah Abbas had been reduced to a helpless pawn on a European chessboard. The Iranian people, fiercely proud and deeply humiliated, finally reached a breaking point. The massive resentment against suffocating foreign domination and the corrupt royal autocracy exploded in 1906 with the Constitutional Revolution. It was a remarkable, unprecedented moment. Intellectuals, powerful Shia clerics, and wealthy bazaar merchants united, marching in the streets of Tehran, staging massive sit-ins, and finally forcing the dying Shah to agree to a constitution and a national parliament, known as the Majlis. It was the very first democratic movement in the entire Middle East, But it was immediately, violently undermined by the British and the Russians, who had absolutely no interest in a strong, independent, democratically governed Iran. In 1908, a Russian-officered Cossack brigade literally bombarded the newly formed Iranian parliament building with artillery. And then, in that same fateful year of 1908, the ground shifted forever. In the blazing, barren deserts of southern Iran, British prospectors, working on a concession granted years earlier, struck black gold. It was the very first major discovery of petroleum in the Middle East. The British government, realizing the strategic implications as they transitioned their navy from coal to oil, immediately bought a controlling stake in the newly formed Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The massive reserves of fuel that would power the British Royal Navy to victory through 2 global world wars were pumped directly out of Iranian soil, while the Iranian people, living in grinding poverty, saw virtually none of the astronomical profits. In the chaotic aftermath of the First World War, during which Iran was used as a battlefield by foreign armies and suffered a devastating famine that killed up to 2 million people, the Qajar dynasty completely collapsed. Into this power vacuum stepped an illiterate, towering, but highly capable military officer named Reza Khan. Marching his Cossack troops into Tehran in a bloodless coup, he systematically consolidated power. By 1925, he formally deposed the last Qajar Shah and crowned himself Reza Shah, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah was obsessed with modernization and national strength. Modeling himself fiercely after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, he forcefully, and often brutally, dragged a highly traditional Iran into the 20th century. He built the monumental Trans-Iranian Railway across impossibly rugged terrain without relying on foreign loans. He established a modern secular education system and founded Tehran University. He forced nomadic tribes to settle, mandated men to wear Western-style clothing, and in a deeply controversial move that alienated millions of traditional Iranians, his police violently tore the hijab off women's heads in the streets, banning the veil in public. Desperate to signal a total break with the weak, colonized past, in 1935, he officially requested the international community to stop using the foreign, Greek-derived word Persia, and to refer to the country by its native, ancient name, Iran. But Reza Shah's suffocating authoritarian grip and his dangerous, strategic flirtation with Nazi Germany as a counterweight to British and Soviet influence proved to be his rapid undoing. When World War II broke out, the Allies could not risk losing the vital Iranian oil fields or the critical supply corridor to the Soviet Union. In 1941, the British and Soviets jointly invaded Iran in a lightning campaign. They crushed the Iranian military in days, forced Reza Shah into exile in South Africa, and placed his young, deeply inexperienced 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on the peacock throne. The post-war era brought the defining open wound of modern Iranian political history. In 1951, a brilliant, charismatic, Swiss-educated, and fiercely nationalist prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh was democratically elected by the Iranian parliament. He immediately made a monumental, earth-shattering decision. He passed a bill to fully nationalize the Iranian oil industry, officially stripping the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company of its monopoly. Mossadegh passionately argued to the United Nations that Iranian oil, pumped from Iranian soil, belonged solely to the Iranian people. The British response was swift, arrogant, and economically merciless. They imposed a devastating global naval blockade, preventing any country from buying Iranian oil, bringing the Iranian economy to its knees. Unable to overthrow Mossadegh militarily, the British appealed to their allies in Washington. Playing masterfully on the deep Cold War paranoia of the newly elected Eisenhower administration, the British convinced the Americans that Mossadegh was losing control of the country and leaning toward the Soviet-backed Communist Tudeh Party. In August 1953, the CIA, led by Operative Kermit Roosevelt alongside Britain's MI6, orchestrated a covert, deeply illegal coup d'etat known as Operation Ajax. They flooded the streets of Tehran with massive bribes, hired violent street gangs and mobsters to incite bloody riots, paid off newspaper editors to print fake stories, and successfully brought down Mossadegh's democratic government. Mossadegh was arrested and placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The young Shah, who had briefly fled the country in a panic, was flown back to Tehran and restored to absolute, unquestioned power. The 1953 coup is the original sin of modern U.S.-Iranian relations. It fundamentally, permanently shattered the Iranian public's trust in Western democratic ideals. For the next 25 years, Mohammad Reza Shah ruled as an absolute, heavily American-backed dictator. Fueled by skyrocketing global oil prices in the 1970s, he launched the White Revolution, an aggressive top-down program of land reform, massive infrastructure development, rapid industrialization, and expanded women's rights. He built glittering, modern cities, purchased billions of dollars of the most advanced American military hardware, and sought to make Iran the undisputed dominant power in the Persian Gulf. In 1971, he threw an unimaginably lavish, multi-million-dollar party in the ancient ruins of Persepolis to celebrate 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy, flying in food from Paris while rural Iranians starved. Because beneath the glittering jet-set surface of Pahlavi, Iran, the country was a boiling pressure cooker. The rapid, chaotic modernization displaced millions of rural, traditional farmers who flooded into the sprawling, impoverished slums of South Tehran. The aggressive secularization and perceived westernization deeply alienated the powerful Shia clerics. And anyone, whether communist, student, or intellectual, who dared to speak out against the Shah's megalomania was met with the terrifying midnight brutality of Savak, his dreaded secret police force, which had been trained by the CIA and Israel's Mossad. Political dissidents were abducted, heavily tortured in notorious prisons like Evin, and murdered. The Shah had successfully built a modern, powerful economy, but he had created a suffocating police state entirely devoid of political freedom. The opposition that would finally break the monarchy came not from the secular left, which had been systematically crushed, but from the pulpit. From his bitter exile in Najaf, Iraq, and later a suburb of Paris, a stern, unyielding, deeply charismatic cleric named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini began smuggling thousands of cassette tapes of his fiery sermons into Iran. They were duplicated and played in mosques across the country. Khomeini masterfully fused ancient Shia religious concepts of martyrdom and righteous resistance against tyranny with modern, Marxist-leaning, anti-imperialist, revolutionary rhetoric. He promised an Islamic Republic, free from Western cultural corruption, free from the brutal dictatorship of the Shah, and grounded in divine, equitable justice. By late 1978, the streets of Iran were completely paralyzed by general strikes. The defining moment came on Black Friday in September, when the Shah's troops opened fire on a massive crowd of protesters in Tehran's Haleh Square, killing dozens, perhaps hundreds. The blood was in the streets, and the point of no return had been crossed. Millions of people, from secular university students to devout bazaar merchants, from communists to clerics, marched in unified hatred against the Shah. The army, overwhelmed and refusing to shoot their own people, began to fracture. On January 16, 1979, an exhausted, cancer-stricken Shah boarded a Boeing 707 and fled Iran, crying as he left, never to return. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini descended from the sky on a chartered Air France jet, greeted by millions of screaming, weeping supporters. The monarchy that had existed, in one form or another, since the days of Cyrus the Great, was dead. The 1979 Islamic Revolution physically shook the world. It was a massive, unprecedented geopolitical earthquake. But the broad utopian promises of the revolution, freedom, democracy, and equality, quickly vanished into blood and terror. Khomeini ruthlessly, brilliantly outmaneuvered and purged the secular, leftist, and moderate political factions who had actually helped overthrow the Shah. He established a strict, uncompromising, autocratic theocracy governed by the principle of velayat-e-faqih, the absolute guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Women were forced back into the chador and hijab. Music and Western culture were banned. In November 1979, radical, anti-American university students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 agonizing days. It was a massive public act of defiance against the superpower that had engineered the 1953 coup and had just admitted the dying Shah for medical treatment, and it permanently, fatally poisoned relations between the two nations. As Iran was consumed by violent internal purges, firing squads, and international diplomatic isolation, its aggressive neighbors saw a golden opportunity. In September 1980, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein launched a massive, unprovoked surprise invasion of Iran. Saddam hoped to quickly seize Iran's oil-rich western province of Khuzestan, believing the Iranian military was entirely hollowed out by post-revolutionary chaos and officer purges. He severely miscalculated. The Iranian people, drawing on deep, ancient reservoirs of Persian nationalism and the potent Shia theology of martyrdom, mobilized in the millions. The Iran-Iraq War became one of the longest, bloodiest, and most devastating conventional conflicts of the entire 20th century. It rapidly devolved into horrors not seen since the trenches of World War I. It featured static trench warfare, massive artillery barrages, and horrifying human wave attacks, where young Iranian boys, some wearing plastic keys to paradise around their necks, ran through minefields to clear paths for the tanks. Saddam Hussein's forces, deeply frustrated by the Iranian numbers, resorted to the horrific, widespread use of chemical weapons, mustard gas and nerve agents, against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians, often with the tacit intelligence support of Western nations who feared the spread of Khomeini's Islamic Revolution. The war dragged on for 8 agonizing years. In 1988, an American naval cruiser, the USS Vincennes, mistakenly shot down an Iranian civilian passenger jet over the Persian Gulf, killing all 290 people on board. Shortly after, a bitter Ayatollah Khomeini finally accepted a UN ceasefire, describing it as drinking from a poisoned chalice. The borders did not move an inch. When the guns finally fell silent, nearly 1 million people were dead. The war deeply, permanently traumatized the Iranian national psyche. It also militarized the new Islamic Republic, forging the hardline Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, into an elite, massively powerful military and economic state within a state. Today, the modern nation of Iran is a place of profound, complex, almost dizzying contradictions. It is ruled by a hardline, aging theocratic elite that aggressively enforces strict religious laws, cracks down violently on internal dissent, controls the media, and actively projects its geopolitical and military power across the Middle East through a vast, highly effective network of proxy militias in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. It is a nation crippled by massive international economic sanctions due to its nuclear program, struggling with inflation, corruption, and environmental crises. Yet beneath this rigid, heavily armored state apparatus lies one of the most highly educated, culturally sophisticated, secular-leaning, and globally connected youth populations in the entire Middle East. It is a nation with a booming underground art scene, world-class cinema, and a deep love for poetry. It is a nation where, time and time again, from the massive Green Movement protests of 2009 to the powerful Woman Life Freedom Movement, young women and men have risked their lives in the streets, cutting their hair, burning their compulsory hijabs, and facing down bullets to demand basic human dignity, echoing the ancient, eternal Iranian struggle against tyranny and darkness. To look at Iran today simply through the narrow, polarized lens of the last 40 years of headlines is to entirely miss the point of this place. This is not a fragile, synthetic state that was drawn on a map by European colonialists with a ruler and a pen. This is a massive, ancient, pulsing civilization. It is a culture that has survived the Macedonian spears of Alexander, the relentless swords of the Arab armies, the apocalyptic fire of Genghis Khan, the covert manipulations of the British, and the suffocating pressure of modern geopolitics. The kings and the ayatollahs, the great invasions and the bloody revolutions, they are all just fleeting chapters in a massive, sprawling epic that has been writing itself for 5,000 years. The Iranian Plateau remains, as it always has been, the fortress at the absolute center of the world, quietly guarding the deep memory of an empire that once touched the edge of the known earth, waiting, enduring, and watching for whatever history demands of it next.